This one is about incentivizing and measuring science for policy impact. Policy reforms require setting goals and measuring impact, of course, but what does success actually look like in science for policy? How can science for policy impact be mapped and evaluated? And how can we create the right incentives for both researchers as well, of course, as policymakers? Now, to debate this, we have a panel packed full with people, and there's two more than those you see here on stage with me, who, without exception, work very closely on the question of how to bring these two worlds, that of science and that of policy making, together, and how can this collaboration be improved. And it's all people, all three here sitting, and the two connected online, whose personal experience makes them sit on various interfaces, be it the interface between science and policy making, or also the interface between social and natural sciences. We have, to start, somebody who set out as a microbiologist, then turned to social sciences, passionate about the question of how we make, mobilize, and use evidence in policy. The Associate Professor of Sociology and Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Please welcome Kathryn Oliver, who is connected online. Could we have the full picture here? Yes.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much for being with us. We have another trained microbiologist ventured to the side of very applied sciences, not only passionate about public health, about high-quality data for policymakers, and about the tricky question of communicating this data to a wider audience, and somebody who, as a marathon runner on frozen lakes, knows that we're in for the long run here. The main expert in scientific quality at the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. Please welcome Barbara Albiger.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. We have also somebody who is passionate about the question of how we learn what we call knowledge, what we might misinterpret sometimes as absolute truth. Somebody with a background in political science, with an experience in academia, but who has made most of her career shaping European policy at the European Commission, the head of the sector of public administration and governance at the EC's DG Reform, Mina Shoylekova. Please give a very warm welcome to Mina. We have somebody who set out as a policymaker, working 7 years for the Danish government in different roles, but then turned to a career in academia on the very question of how science is taken up and communicated, now a full professor of science communication at Aalborg University. Please welcome David Budtz Pedersen. And last, but certainly not least, we have somebody who, in our preparation call, made it very clear that Brexit and the election of Donald Trump was a wake-up call for her. With all this knowledge out there, this is still happening, raises the question of science in society, but also in policymaking, of course. Somebody who knows that thinking out of the box is valued at her institution, but not necessarily everywhere, and somebody who ended up, a little by coincidence, maybe we come to this, in her field, but then became the co-principal of the Interdisciplinary Research Cluster on Crisis of Expert Knowledge and Authority at the European University Institute, Gaby Umbach.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure being here.
Now, we do have a little longer debate than the one before, so we can spend a little time to get everybody, to know everybody a little bit better. What brought you personally to the field of this interface between science and technology, science and policy making, of course. Gaby, I just mentioned that in our preparation we spoke about Brexit and Trump also. Can you develop a little bit how this informed your career path, actually, and where you're sitting now.
Yeah, it informed, and thank you very much, Olaf, for the introduction. It informed and formed both the research focus and the career path, actually. So I was working already since 2010 here at the European University Institute, focusing very much on quantification in policymaking. So how we deal with data in evidence-informed policymaking, and this, for all of us, I guess, here at the Institute and across Europe, Brexit was a wake-up call. We literally went to bed, everything was okay, and woke up in a different world. So that was one moment where all of what we had previously in European integration studies invested and researched was a bit, for me, pending in a world that was obviously not able to absorb the evidence that we produced in a proper way. And in the line of my previous research on quantification, I had established a cooperation with the European Parliament's Research Service, and there then the opportunity came up to work 2 years together with the Parliament's Research Service. So I moved personally to Brussels to work at the intersection of science and policy, and to work a bit on methodologies, quantification, and to really see how valued and valuable the work of interinstitutional science bodies and science advice bodies is. So there I literally started off my garden of evidence-informed policymaking, and to cultivate what now has become since last year a new research area here at the European University Institute. As I joined back in 2019, we are now establishing a broader research area on knowledge, governance, and transformation. So everything that evolves around how we produce, how we use knowledge, and how this has repercussions in governance and in policy making. So as you see, a very formative and informative coincidence that I guess we are still digesting across the science policy nexus, and globally and within Europe.
Gaby, thank you very much. And I turn to the other panelist who is connected online, Kathryn. When we spoke, we had this sort of small conversation about academics that think policymakers are weirdos. And I guess that mending that view was part of your motivations when you choose the field of interest. What brought you where you are currently?
Thanks. Well, I started out as a molecular biologist, as Olaf said in my introduction, but my lab technique was really bad. So I ended up becoming a social scientist, not just for that reason, but also because I was interested in big questions that you can't really investigate in a lab. And after a few years of doing systematic reviews for different government departments, I became interested in what happened once we'd sent those off. So what happened once they landed on the desk within the government department. And so I ended up doing a PhD, which explored the use of evidence in local government. And my experience of doing that showed me not just that evidence is obviously just one part of the policy process, as we all know, and in fact, not the primary part, but also that to understand, how those bits mesh together, you have to take a broad perspective about how to try and understand not just the motivations of the people involved in the room, but the constraints under which they work. So that one of the things that led me to question the academic role in policymaking and to investigate it more deeply was my observation that nobody apart from me ever attended any of the council meetings. Despite the fact that there were 6 universities in the city where I did my PhD, I was always the only one observing, getting to know the actors, trying to understand the world in which these people operated and what could be really done to support it. And so that set me on a track of trying to understand why there was such a difference between these two different cultures, and why, despite everybody saying that they wanted to get more evidence into policy, that was so difficult to achieve. And so for the last 4 years, for example, I've been spending time in the UK Government Office of Science, which is a science advice office, working directly on academic policy engagement, trying to understand the different mechanisms and incentives, initiatives which bring those two worlds together. And, even there, I found that while my expectation had been that the policy world would be the one that needed to shift in its expectations and practices, in reality, it was nearly always the academic world which needed to adjust how it thought about what policy was, the role of evidence within it and what it meant to be a public intellectual. So academics love to think of policymakers being a sort of a strange, exotic tribe. And actually, I think we need to do a bit of thinking about what we are on the academic side before we start criticizing others. I'll stop there.
It probably goes both ways, actually. Mina, can I say from academic political science right into applied political science? Is that a way to sort of, in a nutshell, resume your CV?
I have a very personal reason actually to do what I'm doing. I got my university education at the time when my country was trying very hard to break from its communist legacy and really...
Just say it's Bulgaria, isn't it?
It's Bulgaria, yes. To really rebuild the country as a modern European country. And that was actually quite painful. It wasn't a very straightforward process. I was studying political science, and obviously the question was, how do you make policies that are deep enough to put you on the right track, but also are effective? And this had turned out to be my profession for the past 20 years. I've been working not only in Bulgaria and for Bulgaria, but across the EU, the many European countries, and it's quite interesting actually to see how policy making can be made
And it
really
sort of, gives you a broader view and also a permanent comparison, of course. Barbara, I heard in previous debates many people saying how much the pandemic was a key moment that changed their sort of vision of this interface between science and policy making. But you joined the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control long before, so I guess you didn't really need this wake-up call. I think it's operated from the technician side. It should work like that.
All right, let's see.
Yeah, it does.
Yes, so actually, I'm a little bit an odd one out here because I do not represent a research organization, but I represent a EU agency, decentralized agency that focus on public health. So, but I'm not completely unrelated to the research world because before joining ECDC, I was a researcher myself, and I have to say that 15 years ago, we were not talking about science for policy, but me as a PhD student and as a postdoc, I was incentivized to actually make my research applied to industry to try to get the funding. So same discussion, different target audience. So, but now representing the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, what I just want to, I will just describe it a little bit so you have a bit of an idea what it is and what we do and why I am here. So ECDC monitors more than 50 infectious disease, and we actually provide risk assessments to prevent infectious disease, the risk of infectious disease for Europe and European citizens. And we also provide a scientific advice and science-based recommendation. So within this science for policy ecosystem, ECDC is sort of an intermediary actor because we have a skilled workforce that can analyze, collect, and evidence and translate it to policy. And we also actually convene and function on a network. So from my side, I can say that we, from a EU agency perspective, we don't need incentive to provide evidence or knowledge to policy. This is part of what we do, and it's part of our funding regulation, and it's part of our job. The reason why I'm here is more on the other side, is that how do we make sure as a EU agency that the evidence we collect, analyze, and transfer and translate has actually an impact or is useful. How do we do that? And this is one of the reasons I joined this conference and this panel, because I would like to discuss that with the other panelists and with you and try to discuss solutions, not only challenges, but also solutions.
Absolutely, and there will be space for questions, and also for all those following us online. Of course, there's this Slido questions open all the time, and you can, here in the audience, you can use them too. And as you've seen in previous debates, they are taken on board. Turning to you, David, communication, and specifically science communication, is, of course, exactly at the heart of this interface between science and policy making, because it's also a question of translation, as Kathryn earlier said, to different cultures that sort of try to speak together. What was your motivation when you ventured from the actual policy making to the question of science communication?
Yeah, thank you, Olaf, and it's a pleasure to join the panel and my excellent co-panelist as well. So I've been working myself, I think now for the better half of the last 2 decades on science and policy, both in policy and in research in universities. So I have had many ways in and out of these conversations. Of course, it's very hard in only 5 minutes to sort of sum up. But let me give you one reason why I found this topic, also the topic of our session today, particularly important. I came as a communication scholar and with a PhD in philosophy, I came to the question of science communication very much with a background in social sciences and humanities. And what I could see very early on in my career was that the way we were measuring the output and impact of these disciplines was still very much and very heavily driven by indicators taken from the natural sciences, and more particularly the biomedical sciences. So when we were looking across the board for indicators for how to measure the value, the public value of research, how to conceptualize the meaning even of contributions from science to society, it was still up until recently only about patents, royalties, startup companies, direct investment from industry, and of course publications, citations, co-authorships. So what I could see very early on as sort of a scholar of impact studies was that we were looking upon the world through a very narrow window. So I set out with my research team in Copenhagen to try to widen that window and develop new indicators and sort of do some of the nuts and bolts of creating new assessment frameworks and new methodologies on the ground with researchers, with the European Commission, the JRC, with the Danish government, to try to then widen sort of the scope for impact assessment, broadly speaking, but also a little bit more specifically in the domain of science to policy. So even though I came with a background in science communication, I ended up in sort of impact assessment, if you like.
Yeah. It's always difficult to sort of have the same relation in this mixed hybrid debates between the online guests and the ones being here, because you don't have the same body language. But Gaby, I think I saw you nodding when David was speaking about the measuring and specifically the way we look through this very small window. Could you just develop on that?
Absolutely. You saw me taking notes, I guess. Put down David in and out and academic quantification. Absolutely. I do think that these two elements are extremely framing and narrowing the corridor of engagement of academics in science policy interactions. We have a highly bibliometric focus on what we define as academic quality. So a strong focus on measuring peer-reviewed journal articles, on top of obviously research funding and teaching qualifications. And there are several discussions going on how to reform this type of academic quantification and assessment. So DORA, Leiden, but also the scope framework are broadening the reform debates around them, are broadening the assessment of academic quality in a way as to bring in more mission-based assessments, also more value-based assessment potentially, that could place policy interaction, engagement, embedment in political processes into the value assessment and quality assessment for promotional systems. So we do have a lot of disincentives that hinder this revolving door in and out. That Kathryn, in your CV, you are doing a lot, but that's not, let's say, easily accessible and not easily reproducible for young researchers, right? It depends on the very individual stance and the very individual career path. So we actually indeed need to reassess and also re-inform how we disincentivize engagement with policy and science advice in policy within the academia. We need to embed training in academic education that qualifies academics to engage. Obviously, this has to do with a huge body of synthesis methodologies, review techniques, but also engagement. engagement structures, civil engagement, trends and interdisciplinary approaches, which in the disciplinary assessment of academic quality are not as present as they would need to be a quality tag for engaged academics, let's put it like that. The different panels yesterday discussed that already, and I think it's good to bring that on in a very early stage of this panel, because that also relates to the sort of stigma that is still around academics engaging with politics, right? So there's a bit of a stigma in the younger generation that is para-academic. When you drop out, you go into policy advice, but this is actually not the point. I would love us to see framing the engaged academics more as academics plus. So we need to have the thematic excellence and expertise, but we also need to have the politics literacy that it takes around the normativity of evidence use, the different functions of evidence use in policy, to make us academics that are able to give science advice to policymaking. So this is something that I think with what David says are very important points for us to take into consideration in the panel. Thank you.
Gaby, I take two very strong words from your intervention, disincentive and stigma outrightly. David, you just wanted to react on this.
Yeah, sure. I was also very pleased by this expansion of the argument by Gaby. I think that's a good starting point, even though we should also in this session be highlighting some solutions rather than some problems. But I think just for us again to agree on some sort of the scale of the problem, this is not only a matter of numbers and quantification and assessment frameworks, it's also a matter of institutionalized practices. You know, we have had now for more than 25 years offices for technology transfer, tech trans offices at almost all European universities. We have had a very regimented toolbox for doing IP, intellectual property rights. We have been highly incentivized by OECD, European Commission in several framework programs for working closer with industry. But now comes this sort of new world order in which governments are waking up and urgently need scientists also to advise them. While we only have the institutions to sort of transfer knowledge to industry, we did not really have the institutions to transfer knowledge to government. So that's why we're here in a certain sense. Yeah, and that's also why we need to be solution-oriented, talk about funding, talk about the responsibility of the different institutions involved, and perhaps also address the question of leadership, because that's really where the culture can change and where we need to see some institutional innovations.
So building the new world order where sort of the pre-established institutions can be repurposed in a way that's a broad undertaking, of course, which we hear. Still a little bit on that question of measuring, because this debate is very much about measuring and incentivizing. Barbara, you said incentives, you don't need them, you have them in your job description. Hence, I guess the question of measuring is an important one to you.
Indeed, we do not need incentives. Like in our funding regulation at ECDC, we have clearly specified that we need to provide scientific opinion, scientific advice that are operational and accessible to policymakers. So the incentives are there. But how do we make sure that the evidence, the knowledge, the science we provide to policymakers is not lost in translation? And there I think we have been discussing the last day similar issue on, we measure only what is measurable, but is it really what we need? And of course, I'm coming from an agency and we start somewhere and we also work with indicators. And of course, we have been stuck with the bibliometric indicators, but those are not reflecting on what is the impact we have on policymaking. But the question is for an EU agency, for instance, is also when and what to measure. When do we actually measure our impact? Do we measure it when we see that our evidence is taken up and cited in a policy? Or when the policy itself is implemented, how it has been implemented, but also how it has been accepted? And there comes the issue that we have to look at contribution. And even if we are looking at how much we could have contributed to a policy, and we realize that we live in a complex world where there's many actors, and the small evidence we provide is only one part of the solution. So, looking at solution, I go back to David, because we had this very nice discussion yesterday, and until this morning I didn't know that actually David was going to be on the panel. So, but it was really interesting because I approached David and Kristen Kruger from the GRC with this problematic, saying how can EU agency actually measure the impact of their knowledge and evidence onto policy, and how do we assess? So, I would very much like to discuss solutions with the panel. Actually.
Let's do moves to solutions in a short while. Kathryn, you brought no, I wanted to say, Baba, you just spoke about not getting lost in translation, and Kathryn, you were the one bringing up the idea of different cultures. Is there a way sort of to train the translation, to improve the translation, to make sure that we get not lost in translation between these two cultures?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I guess my answer is a classic academic's answer, which is that we don't know, and more evidence is needed about how to do this. So the reality is that although there's been a huge expansion in initiatives trying to promote evidence use, for example, a great number of policy units within universities, a huge number of fellowship schemes for people to be seconded into government, or for similar sorts of initiatives, hardly any of them have been evaluated. So a couple of years ago, I did a mapping report where we found over 1,900 different initiatives from within the UK and internationally, and only 3% of those had a publicly available evaluation. So the reality is that while there's been a huge growth in activity, we're not really able to say what types of interventions work to promote evidence use really successfully. What we do know is that linear approaches on their own tend not to be very effective. So merely pushing evidence out, I think everybody in the room would agree that we know that's not very effective. There has been more attention recently on sort of relational type of initiatives. So, for example, providing people with the skills that you mentioned, Olaf. So training people to communicate in different ways, or to give people opportunities to build relationships and to learn more about the soft skills which underpin a lot of this work. And some of those seem to be promising approaches, although we can't really say, for example, what types of candidates really benefit from those sorts of training schemes. What we also know is that none of that is really effective unless the system is there to absorb those approaches and to support them. And what I mean by system are things like infrastructure, jobs, career pathways. And I'm glad to hear that incentives aren't required for all of us. And I agree in a very large extent. All of us are paid through public money, and therefore all of us have a public duty to see that the society benefits from what we do. But the reality is that for lots of people, their universities do not know how to make use of somebody who has spent time in government and then comes back to the host organisation. It's like, you've had your fun, now can you come back and get on with your teaching, please? And that's just not good enough. We need to do better.
Thank you very much. Mina, we're still staying on this question of incentives, and as previously was said, disincentives even, sometimes by Gaby. How, from the European perspective, this question, how can we incentivize and how can we not or stop disincentivizing?
I'd like to come to the question of measurement first, because
yes.
I think that's an important point, and it has a lot to do with incentives and disincentives.
It's tight, of course.
Yeah. Well, measurement is important, but there are a few famous scientists that said that everything that counts is very difficult to actually count, to measure. And when it comes to policies especially, and the impact into policies, I'm not sure that measuring is really the way to go. It's more about the quality of the exchange. And here evaluation is the method that will be much more important. And I have to admit that when I first read the question for this panel, how does success look like of using science for policy, I had a long pause of digging into my mind, what are examples to give?
Yes.
And that pause made me actually think that the first thing that we need to talk about are really the good stories, because there are a lot, if you start looking into that, there are a lot of cases where really policy making has been informed by science, and we have very good results. Now, it's important also to think, to keep in mind that the policy making community is not coherent. You have the political level that has a very different timeline, and that's the one that usually wants very quick answers and evidence because they have a very short timeline. But there is also the public administration that is usually the technocratic body that is there, and building relations at different levels, I think, is very important in order to create these incentives. Leadership was mentioned, and here the tone that is given by politicians is extremely important because they are the ones that set the way in which the way in which policy making is done. Yesterday I was at another forum where we were discussing strategic policy making. How can you make strategic policy making? And that also comes to issues like managing or addressing climate change or making environmental policies. These are things that require really a lot of time, a lot of long-term thinking. But then if you have to have a program and actions for the next 2-4 years, apparently there is a mismatch, and we need to see indeed how we can bring the conversation of the different communities together in order to have better outcomes, policy outcomes. And one thing that Suzanne mentioned this morning, I think, is also very important, including the society, because very often we talk only about incentivizing politicians or policy making, but you see that very often their solutions to policy problems is just because they want to address the expectation of a society now, the short-term thinking, while the long-term results sometimes require very, very difficult solutions, very difficult choices, and you need to explain those.
And this mismatch between long-term and short-term, or what actually is long-term and what is short-term for politicians, for policymakers and for scientists, is sort of a difficult path to navigate. David, you wanted to immediately react on that?
I think I will try to be a hardliner in that discussion. I do think that numbers are important, and that creating better data about policy impact and policy engagement is one part of what we need to be doing. Again, it ties back to the fact that in the lack of any strategic and operational data for policy engagement and policy uptake, it will still be the bibliometric data and all the statistics about commercialization that's going to drive the policymakers, the funding agencies. So we need to be able to, at least to some degree, collect and annotate some of the activities that we believe are conducive for policy impact or good proxies of it. And then we need to do what the JRC did in a report a couple of years back. We need to build narratives on top of numbers. So we need to also make our impact case studies a little bit more trustworthy and credible by actually providing some ground figures. So I believe, also going back to what Barbara said, like if you can find a meaningful way to sort of decide within your institution, your program, or your project, what kind of activities do we believe are important to reach our purpose, then I would be a hardliner and say, let's then collect some data about those activities. Those might be meetings, workshops, co-creation, partnerships. That might be downloads of our newsletter, the policy briefs. It might be joining a hearing in Parliament. It might be whatever you might think of. And then on top of that data, after you collected it for a reference period, then you can then build your more credible narrative. It goes back, if you allow me, Olaf, it's just a short anecdote. We were in a committee meeting at the Danish Parliament, and one of the members of Parliament said, you humanities and social science people, you always just tell good anecdotes about the impact. Why don't you present us with some data?
Which you are doing now.
Which I'm doing now. But wait a second. So I went back to my research team and to one of the funding agencies. Let's develop some indicators. Let's present them with a whole dashboard of broader impact indicators. Took me 3 years, did it. Went back to Parliament. Presented all the numbers, like how much collaboration, how much openness, how much visibility, how much impact on museums, on public schools, on news media. And then the policymaker said, you know what, David, we policymakers, we really like narratives.
Excellent. Excellent. Nice story. Barbara, I saw you nodding when David mentioned this idea of building narratives on numbers?
Definitely, because this is a path that we are investigating and investing in, is really mapping who do we talk to, who do we involve, and really being transparent about it. And I think this will be bringing this feedback loop. So you're trying to, from the beginning, thinking, what is it you want to achieve? So when you work in an area, is there a societal challenge you want to address? Is there a policy area you want to address? And from there, trying to go backwards and say, well, what do I need to actually influence that area? And what do I have already? And very much trying to see from the beginning who to involve and mapping this pathway towards the impact. And I think being very transparent, I would say that for a scientist, being transparent, saying, I reached out to policymaker with that work. And the same for us, we have reached out, but what has happened? If nothing has happened, we are still very clear and transparent about it. And that will also build trust with society to science is actually reaching out, agencies are reaching out. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will be taken up, but we are very transparent and accountable for having done that. So I think the narrative is very important. How many interaction, who do you interact with, and what is the outcome of this interaction? Even if nothing happens, this is still an impact because you tried, you reached out. So
you want to react on
if I may, I just wanted to come into something that Barbara said. It's not important only for the researchers to reach out. We need to make this possibility structured, systemic, and we need to create actually the avenues in which the research communities and the policymakers can really speak on a regular basis, because some of the things are not necessarily, some of the evidence and the knowledge that can be taken is not about solving the problems of today. Actually, where we see that science could be extremely useful is agenda setting. What are the issues for the longer term that we can start digging into today and start building the knowledge and understanding how they work, so that we can early on build the solutions or the possible policy approaches.
Yeah, agenda setting, very, very important point. You wanted to react afterwards. I want to bring Gaby in. We don't need to forget our online participants.
I just want to jump on what Mina said. She said something very important. One area where scientists have a big impact is about reporting gaps. And that is an area where to set the agenda, we need to report gaps. We need to look at what are the gaps. And there is a very, very strong area where scientists actually can influence policy making.
Which is exactly tied to the question of agenda setting. There is a problem identified. Let's go there. Gaby, we were on this question of narratives, and earlier we spoke about the importance of the election of Donald Trump and Brexit also, which is also based on narratives. So there is a clear difference between there are narratives out there and there are narratives to be built in answer to this. And this also ties, if I understand you correctly, to your research cluster, isn't it? How to spread other narratives? This is probably what it comes down, a very naive question.
Before I come to that, I wanted to react to 2 points that Mina and David have brought forward. So if we look into the, let's put it like that, claimed outcomes and impact, effect of evidence uptake in politics, we're very much on the measurement side, on the soft data part, right? So the perception, subjective data, which makes it extremely difficult to, at transnational level, come up with an adequate measure, because that requires contextualization and localization of the impact measure. This is one part that, with a bit of a caution, I would say we always need to keep in mind these 2 things: adequacy of the data developed, context in which it is meaningful, and the normative impact. So I'm not, obviously, because that's also part of my research, not against the quantification here, but I do think what Karcher et al. Did 2021, I guess, to look into what were the claimed outcomes. What did knowledge exchange actors, scientists engaging in politics, claim to be the outcome, and develop from there the different categories of potential impact, and to look into proxies that, although subjective and perception-based, can give us an idea of how, not where, but how evidence uptake can be impactful. So usability, structural differentiation, structural developments, community building, societal impact that is more long-term. So there's a lot to do in defining the preferred outcome and impact of evidence uptake. Apart from, and now I come to something, a quote from Mina, I guess, nothing has happened. So we need also to invest on our side of the academia in politics literacy. If nothing has happened, that doesn't mean that a policymaker didn't understand a piece of evidence. It means that there are different interests, values, and different elements at play that disincentivize the policymaker to take up a particular piece of evidence. So when informing politics with evidence we produce on the academic side, we need to be literate about the policy process, about behavioral aspects of policymakers' engagement with evidence, about the different functions of evidence in policymaking. Because apart from the factual tokens of information, obviously there are strategic and also normative aspects at hand when policymakers use evidence. This is an important part, just as a reaction to the previous panel contributions. In terms of narratives, this has been, if we look into data quantification in politics, that data visualizations, data narratives is an approach where we try to package the information content in a way that is useful for the particular context. It integrates, by doing so, it also adds an individual and very subjective moment of understanding pieces of evidence and using them into politics. I think it's a good approach to make people shy away from using statistics and data in general. We just, with the potential to opening data and factual evidence up to contestation, need to keep in mind that data narratives can also multiply depending on the community where data is used, so narratives in general. I'm wondering in how far this overlayering of the evidence process with a multiplicity of potential narratives depending on stakeholders' incentives to use evidence is adding a layer of complexity that might help in the short term, but complicate long-term developments based on evidence.
David, you wanted to react?
Yeah.
There were several points now.
Also, to avoid misunderstanding, I think it's worth emphasizing again what Gaby says here, that when you use indicators and build indicators, they need to be based on the context in which your purpose is unfolding and manifesting itself. So also going back to Barbara's, it's a good idea to use indicators and numbers as part of your theory of change or your program theory, so that you can use it to create feedback to your own practice rather than just ranking your practice or your project or your program against other programs in completely different national or transnational contexts. I think we also have to be aware of the fact that creating strong impact narratives and case studies, only are meaningful if you have a strong purpose and you have a strong aim and are able to define it. So in that sense, these two things are not each other's enemies. They actually could be conducive.
Thank you very much. Switching now a little bit the focus of debate, because I sensed a very clear desire to speak solutions. So we have sort of ventured into different avenues of difficulties. What can be done now? What is already being done and where to head next in terms of clear solutions? Perhaps, Barbara, a few words?
What can be done? There is plenty that can be done. Having a clear idea on the policy area in which you actually, circulate in, that is one. making sure that you have inbuilt in your project already from the beginning like an approach on how you will transfer your knowledge, how you will translate your knowledge, how you will engage policymakers, how you actually want to follow the achievement, how you want to evaluate that you actually reach that goal. So that is one of the solutions. Maybe I go and ask my colleagues to pitch in there as well.
Solutions. Kathryn, what can be done, where to go? Let's fill a box with good ideas. What can be done?
So my first point would be, as I already said, I think we do need more empirical research into the strategies, structures, systems which promote good evidence use within government, not least understanding what that looks like and what it means to different people. But I would like to describe an initiative that I've been involved with, which doesn't so much focus on academics mapping their own impact or using different indicators to do so, but more on the demand side. So in the UK government, the project that I've been working on them with is to do with the areas of research interest. So about 6 or 7 years ago, we had a review of all of the public funding in the UK, which recommended that in order to promote evidence use within government departments and agencies should say publicly what they wanted to know, what their knowledge gaps were. So they were called statements of knowledge need initially, and now they're known as areas of research interest. Every year they're updated. They are produced by government departments internally. There's different processes used to develop them. They're not research questions. They are literally things that each department and agency publicly states it wants to have discussion about, receive information on, hold knowledge exchange in relation to, and or commission research on. So they are an opening, a conversation starter for policymakers to pull in or to receive information from external stakeholders. And it sounds like a relatively simple, straightforward, static activity. But what we've found is that people respond to them in very different ways, but they offer an enormous opportunity to understand what impact has already been had, as well as maximising the use of what we already know. So, for instance, we analysed the ARIs across the whole of the UK government, of which there are now about 1,800, and we found that for over 80% of them, a significant amount of evidence already exists. So, by sort of putting them all in a searchable database, which is now available online, I'm very happy to share the link to that. You can link that database to funded research projects, to published research, to databases of experts. And we've used an AI algorithm to link them together. So what that means is that officials in government now have a sort of automatic list of people to go and talk to, of evidence that they have available, and of funded research projects, which they can access through Gateway to Research, which is our interface into the UKRI public funded research database. What we don't yet have resources to mobilise that knowledge. So at the moment, it's sort of still on the government official to go and make the next step and to go and talk to people. But if it shows anything, it shows that we need to make better use of what we already have. So there's vast databases of research that needs to be synthesised and mobilised. But at least this is a good step on the way. So in terms of solutions, I think we're seeing this appearing in lots of different places. So we've been talking to Australia about doing some there. The US has a very similar initiative around the learning agendas, although theirs is slightly different. They have more money attached to theirs. But researchers can already look at that database and see to which departments their research is valuable, where it's been picked up, and even in what policy documents it's been cited. So we've been working with Overton, for those of you who are aware of that database, and colleagues there. So watch this space.
Kathryn, thank you very much. Mina, when Kathryn spoke about the idea that agencies, government agencies, should say publicly their knowledge gaps, I immediately thought about your idea of science as helping also the agenda setting, which is basically the conversation we're having here from both sides. Your thoughts on this?
I totally agree that the transparency of what the policy agenda would be, what governments are intending to work on, is extremely important also to inform scientists of how their research could be useful. And that's one thing that we also saw in looking into how ecosystems in a number of countries really look like. In the countries where the government really announces what are their research needs or knowledge needs, that really helps a lot inform in the way in which the collaboration can work. Another element that is extremely important that we saw from our work is not only the leadership and skills that were mentioned earlier, but also the establishment of tools or platforms through which public administration can get access to science, at least as an entry point. I think Barbara was saying a little bit earlier that scientists sometimes feel as producers of Wikipedia pages.
Yeah.
And this is definitely just the starting point to see what is already there so that you can really have a meaningful conversation. But yeah, access to knowledge, scientific knowledge is critical. And what unfortunately we see that lately in public administrations, you have more generalists than specialists. So that really kind of makes the conversation very difficult. But another thing that we discovered, and I find it very, very interesting, a thought that that never occurred to me. It was mentioned on a number of occasions that actually the transparency of publicly kept data, so everything that's in registers and different platforms of the public institutions, actually is the starting point for researchers to do their. So the government is very often the provider of data on the basis of which research can take place, and therefore the effort to provide open access to data is extremely important also to make the loop work. And then beyond that, I would like to mention again the cooperation that we have with the Directorate for Research and Innovation and with the Joint Research Center of the Commission, but also with the Secretariat-General that is setting the standards within the Commission of Policy Making that promotes very much this collaboration and use of science in policy making. Now, under the technical support instrument, we are really trying to help member states understand how their own systems work, what they can do more, and actually also exchange experience so that they can really go forward.
David, you wanted to react?
Yes, I think we should take that opportunity and your invitation, Olaf, to really think about solutions. And what Kathryn said about the areas of research interest from the UK is a really good example to ask the demand side, the policymakers, to formulate their research interests becomes a very good place for opening up a conversation and for researchers and research institutes and their knowledge brokers to understand what is happening. At the same time, staying at the demand side, building more capacity, building better skills. We have now the Commission staff working document, for example, also emphasizing that there needs to be a better understanding of how to procure and commission research into government, into policy making. You know, you need to be able to organize expert committees, you need to be able to understand peer review, evidence hierarchies, so working with the policymakers in order to create that enhanced understanding. Have a couple of more items on solutions. I think one of the major problems we are confronted with is searchability. We are living in an age of search. Everything is supposed to be searchable online. Most experts and academics are not. You will go to a lot of European universities and their websites, and you will only find long lists of publications, and publications. Yeah. The areas of expertise, the area of competence, the area of interest is often not even highlighted. So if I'm a policymaker, again going back to Kathryn's point, if I'm sitting in the demand side, I'm looking for input. Who should I call? We know from statistical analysis that policymakers notoriously call upon the same people, mostly engineers, mostly economists, mostly men, and they are all sitting on the same expert committees all the time. So we need to enhance searchability, again going back to our own responsibility as knowledge producers and, you know, enriching our own data. And then I think also I took the note from what Kathryn said about all the initiatives for science for policy she found in her study, that only such a few of them are evaluating their own success. We of course need to allocate resources for evaluation. And we need to look at what works and what does not work, and ask that as part of the funding schemes. I think that could be on the ground solutions that would help promote this conversation.
Barbara, I saw you nodding.
No, I definitely,
several points there.
I definitely agree, and I agree especially on the representativeness. We should work more on representativeness, on opening not only the data and the science, but opening the expertise. And I can take an example. We ourselves at ECDC, we have an expert directory that is not open, but that we can consult, that anyone externally can actually reach out, register, put a conflict of interest declaration as well, and say, well, this is my expertise, and whenever you would need our expertise for independent panel, you can reach out. But this is definitely a good point, and it might be a part of the solution also to make it more open and more transparent, and who is out there available and willing, because it is also a will. It's not being only available, but it's also willing, and that we be able to reach out, but also reach representativeness, which I think is very, very important also for science for policy.
Mina, you wanted to react there.
I wanted to add one more thing, actually, to all the solutions that were mentioned, or the important points that were mentioned so far. We think very much about the use of science as ready-made knowledge, but actually in policy making, what we are discovering in a way now, or what we are trying to insist on, is that policy making is a very iterative process, and you actually very often learn on the go. Yeah. You have policies, you need to evaluate where you are, and you need to adapt and improve. And in order to do that, there are a lot of new approaches that are coming into policy making, where actually scientists and policymakers can really work together in order to understand what is the reality, what are the interactions, what really needs to be changed. And it's really great that there are the examples of policy experiments, for example, is growing. That's an area where collaboration is extremely important. Behavioral studies also help a lot in a number of cases. Counterfactual studies could also be a very good way in order to evaluate policies, but also to show the impact of science in policy making. So these are kind of other ways, other instances in which collaboration is extremely important.
Gaby, I saw you nodding several times.
Yes, absolutely. I think I want to make 3 points that in part summarize and in part emphasize new things. So I guess what is necessary is 3 main points, starting from what Kathryn said, synthesis, and David with searchability, but also from the demand and supply side, both literacies. We need to really work on literacies, and this is not just for people to understand statistics, for example, but really to have a multidimensional idea of what it takes to be literate for evidence use in policymaking, both from the supply and demand side. So the statistical, the ethical concerns, the politics literacy, to understand why a certain actor uses and takes a particular piece of evidence, but also the strategic planning. So an idea of literacy, evidence literacy, that includes technical skills, the knowledge on context relevance, and the knowledge on intersections of literacies. What do I need to take into consideration in policy area, climate change, for defining a context for evidence use? And this is something that we really need to beef up on the academic side, but also on the policymaker side. Third point is indeed institutionalization with some sub-points. We talked about the communication part. David mentioned that in part, science communication versus corporate communication in universities. This is a huge problem, that many universities tend to rather have corporate communication styles than science communication at their interfaces, websites also, but also the anticipation in institutionalization, right? So the understanding of what the next policy cycle needs in terms of evidence to inform policymaking, anticipatory governance, also foresight questions to understand which policies are there to remain, are there to become long-term relevant, And combined with that, the evidence needs and demands that governments will face. So these 3 points actually, I think, are important to look into when we create solutions for evidence.
Three clear takeaway points. I would like to open to questions from the audience. There are 2, 3 already here. In the meantime, until the microphone comes, just one point. Mina mentioned this idea of learning on the go while you're policy making, and you had this idea of better procuring research. How do they go together? Because this is about totally different timelines, actually.
Sure. Yeah. I again, probably in this field, the two does not necessarily exclude each other. To be able to work together on the go means that you have sustained relationships, that you have networks, that you have both formal and informal avenues to work together. Whereas procurement is, of course, more if you're in an emergency or you're in a crisis or you have a very well-defined problem that you need advice on, then again you need to sort of be able to call upon and organize the right expert advisory bodies to serve you. But I think what Mina said is probably even more important, actually, is the day-to-day interactions and creating those sort of that workflow, that knowledge flow between demand and supply side, if we want to use that metaphor.
Questions? You were the first one.
Hello, my name is Ciara Leonard. I'm from University College Dublin. Just as part of the building blocks for solutions in this, I'd like to understand the panel's view on 2 aspects. In terms of the measurement and impact part, we've identified in Ireland the need to look at some aspects of what the UK has done in terms of policy interfaces, if you like, between a network of universities interested in policy engagement with policymakers, in terms of making it easier for policymakers to engage with hundreds, if you like, in the UK, but in terms of Ireland, 15 research institutes and universities, and also in terms of professionalised functions within universities to support the training, the assessment, the communication, and also again to be that interface between policymakers and government and parliamentarians and the institution itself. I'd like to understand the panel's view of that.
Yeah, perhaps Kathryn is the right one to answer, but I think it sounds terrific. I mean, I think that sounds like doing it right. Of course, as we know from the UK, and we also know from the REF, it is still very much driven by what we call an attribution model of evaluation, in which you have to be actually quite linear in the way that you're describing your impacts, in terms of having an end user that is willing to testify that he or she or them found the research to be useful. So it's still like somewhat a relationship in the REF case studies between a provider and an end user. If you could get out of that and look more on contribution analysis and forging these links and workflows that Mina talked about, then I think that would be a helpful way of sort of having a more fluid and dynamic model for policy engagement, rather than this sort of, I have something I need to tell you, now you gotta listen, and when you listened, like at a library, then you can come and hand me back my book. This is not how policy engagement works most of the time.
Kathryn, I see you smiling indeed.
Yes, I know. I completely agree. And the way the REF has been set up tends to reward universities and researchers who have access to a lot of resources to help them write these narratives and case studies. So the system and the evaluation system both tend to promote inequities within the evidence base, which does not help policymakers reach the diversity of evidence that they need. So I completely agree with David. I think it's really all about trying to understand what types of evidence have had an impact and where, and by understanding those case studies, by tracing backwards, by talking to people who've been involved in cases where things really have changed or haven't changed, or there have been really fruitful conversations or good relationships, what's made the difference there and what's underpinned those examples of good practice that we could learn more about. I'm not sure if that entirely answered your question, though.
Thank you very much. There's another question in the back there.
Yes, hello. I'm Rudy. I'm the coordinator of SAPEA. So what I have heard here, which is very interesting, is that we are kindly a lot of anticipating what might create impact, and we are trying to anticipate, so to say, what policymakers need, and this is, so to say, the perspective of what we are talking about. Instead of having a dialogue with the politicians and with the administration of what is needed and come to agreement and on how to feed, and especially when to feed the evidence which is needed into the system. And if you have this kind of agreement, which we at least try in the scientific advice mechanism of the European Commission, then it's also easy to measure the impact. Because if you have the agreement, then you have goals, then you also know how and when you communicate what to whom exactly, and then you can measure at the end if this has worked, and you can also ask those who has received the things if this was useful or not. So this, all I want to say is, and I would like to know if you agree on that, so the more we talk to the politicians who need that, maybe it's the biggest piece of the box of solutions we should seek for.
Talking to the politicians, Mina, I think you were
Talking to the politicians, well, I can also say from my personal experience that the talk between the two communities, the researchers and the policymakers, is not always straightforward, because unfortunately we come, well, fortunately, I don't know, we operate in different universes, and sometimes what we see, for example, is that we really need knowledge that can be actionable. That's how we call it. Well, in my area, for example, in public administration, we have either very low micro cases that explain how a thing happens, or very big theories, and in the middle we're missing a lot of knowledge of what really could inform action and make organizations in public administration, in public sector work much better. That's just one example. So conversations are important, and this is not going to something that can be solved very easily. It's a process that will take place until the two communities come closer and start to understand how each of them work and where they can really contribute. I want to raise one more thing, and it's kind of remotely related to that, but it's important also because skills were mentioned on many occasions. And one thing that I find extremely useful is the competency framework that was developed by the JRC recently, and it has a focus both on policymakers but also on researchers. So how I can develop the skills in order to allow this collaboration and conversation to work better.
And as you underline, the skills on both sides, in
exactly,
both communities. Yes?
Yeah, no, just to briefly state that it would be sad to leave this conversation with the idea that we were only talking from within science to anticipate society. I think what Kathryn mentioned here about the areas of research interest, what Mina mentioned about having a continuous dialogue, which the SAM also has and SAPEA also have, building networks, having conversation, doing policy labs, forging a culture of collaboration and interaction. Totally, very important comment that needs to happen. This cannot be anticipated from within the fishbowl. We are not goldfish looking out into society and trying to predict what's happening. That needs to be done in dialogue with politicians, but also other professionals. For example, the policymakers, the professionals in hospitals, citizens. So definitely it's a valid point that this cannot be done in a silo.
Yeah, absolutely. Talking, communication.
And if I take it just from the side of ECDC, this is how we work. We do collect needs and priorities, especially from our professional network, so more from the member state point of view, and we actually co-frame with them what is the need for evidence to be able to address the gaps and the needs and the priorities, and then we are communicating to policymakers to try to really align the needs and the priorities, definitely. So the co-framing and the constant dialogue. For an EU agency, it's maybe a little bit easier because it works in networks. So we constantly work with networks, so there's an iterative process, both with our technical networks, but also with the policymakers.
Thank you very much. There is a question in the first row.
Yes, thanks. I'm Edvards Koks from the Ministry of Education and Science in Latvia. So I'm speaking from a science policy making perspective, but also a science and technology studies perspective. I have a rather lengthy preamble, but I wrote it down so it will end, and the question will be about measurement and unintended or perverse consequences or incentives. So when we discuss measuring, valorizing results or the impact, much of the discussion here has been on evidence specifically, which is only part of the work, and I really appreciated the discussion yesterday mentioning other questions such as framing or epistemological considerations, which are even more difficult to show up on impact, to say that in a policy discussion I helped reframe the question. It's very difficult to translate that as an impact. Fully qualitative assessments or models like the UK REF are very administratively taxing, particularly for science policy makers who are meant to incentivize some action or another. On the other hand, measuring the frequency of the engagement is also a poor proxy because these can be done mechanically. You can go to a lot of meetings and say that's an impact. You can consult a lot of documents that have low impact themselves and say that's an impact. So the general wisdom, I think, is that you get what you measure. So the question is, how do we ensure that there is good mechanisms for valorization, for engagement, without creating these perverse incentives? Of course, I would like some direct response to the worry, but on the other hand, since we're talking about solutions, feel free to give a utopian view of what the perfect mechanism may look like. Thanks.
David, you were nodding. You get what you measure?
Yes, that is completely true.
I
think, like, you know, at least two comments to that. Yes, for sure, there is a tendency for any new measure to become a target in itself, and then it will be gamed. And of course we have to be responsible, and part of that solution is to do what co-panelists talked about, building your indicators and your measurement in the context that it's supposed to be working in. So that will not produce or give you any sort of general overview or general comparability across programs or even countries or sectors, but it will give you good indicators if you're doing the right thing within your program. You know, so I think that's one thing that needs to be done, and you would be able to do that without gaming the entire system. Also, going back to where we started an hour ago, in the absence of any other competing indicators, we will just be stuck with the current ones. So yes, your argument might be right, but it also applies for bibliometrics and scientometrics, and it also applies for econometrics, which we are now measured by. So without sort of diversifying our indicators and our incentives, I see quite a bumpy road ahead.
Mina, I see you have the microphone ready.
Measuring and stories, I think there is an interesting example that I can give. I can illustrate why actually both are important. You probably remember before COVID there was a big buzz about basic income.
Yeah.
And the Finnish government was doing an experiment with that. Now, what made the news is the numbers that said that actually the objective of this policy experiment to incentivize more people into job practically failed because there was a very marginal difference between the usual activation policies. But what was more important, what didn't make the news is actually why they think this result was not achieved. And that was the discovery that in order for this policy to really work, there was a necessity for change in a range of other policies that are linked to other types of social support, health insurance, taxation, so in a big range of policy. And for policymakers, I think what's important is not so much the final number of the result of the experiment, but rather the knowledge around that. So that's why I would say, if you want to know about the impact, it's important to keep both the story and the numbers together.
Yeah, which comes back to our building narratives on figures. But we have only a little time left, and I still would like to take questions. You had one.
Okay, thank you very much. My question actually was for Gaby Umbach. I was very inspired by her idea of politics literacy. Yeah. And my question relates to rhetoric, which has a very bad reputation of the art of convincing the people. But actually, don't we see that people are lacking the critical capacity to understand sometimes very poor rhetoric? So the question would be, can it be that we have rhetoric with more logic, better backed by scientific evidence, and which translates into, as was said, knowledge in action, and not just information, providing information and communication, but actually dealing with this rhetoric. Thank you.
Knowledge and action and better rhetorics, informed rhetorics. Gaby.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for this excellent question. I will answer that and then come back to remarks very quickly to the previous question. What I do absolutely think, and I fully agree, is that we underestimate the relevance of critical thinking for any future citizen and policymaker. And that also relates to understanding the difference in between an information content and knowledge that is injected into policymaking, and knowledge becomes relevant through context. So indeed, to understand what the particular piece of evidence at hand, what function that has in formulating a policy in a particular in a given community at a given moment in time. So this contextualization and critical reflection on what type of knowledge does a piece of information that is injected in policymaking brings is an essential part of these literacies. I know that this is something very alien to our time and timing in politics, because it requires a bit more investment in our own enlightenment, if you so wish, our education, our understanding, and also our understanding of us being not only academics, but also engaged citizens. So it needs a bit of a work on how we want citizenry to develop, to understand politics, and how we want politicians also to understand that citizens understand. This is a more ontological question about politics and citizens and participation. Absolutely. And that is, from my point of view, this multidimensional literacy requires more of a societal development that I think is urgently needed in that moment of time. I wanted to come back to two questions of measurement, this ideal thing, and then to Rudy again with the differentiation question. Just a quick thing, if I could make a future, if I could design and bake me a future, it would indeed be contextual measurement. So rather measuring the impact of a particular mission, of a particular activity, and then focusing on a multidimensionality also here, use and usability, the process, but also societal impact, social outcome, political outcome, outcome on the personal practices. So more to understand, yes, it has informed policymaking, but also understanding where the narrative, the public understanding around a policy issue has changed and has been impacted by evidence use. So these more soft rather than hard impact variables, if you so wish, are important. On Rudy, absolutely. I mean, I guess that's the question of what type of science advice we are looking into. These more organizational, collective ones can be more anticipatory. If you look, for example, at the Parliament's practice of individual MEPs being able to request pieces of evidence and information, science advice, there we are a bit of a more fragmented environment where this planning cannot necessarily be anticipatory, and where we need a different flexibility in terms of how the dialogue with politicians has a collective impact or a collective function.
Gaby, I take from the earlier part of your answer the call to just keep in mind that we're also as citizens here as one of the takeaways, which is curiously one of the takeaways of the very last sentences of our previous debate here. I think there are many, many more questions, or at least the questions all lead to more questions that could be debated, but we're running already over time, and we're having in less than 15 minutes now already the feedback session here, and I need to give the rapporteurs time to sort of sort their mind a little bit. This is why I would like to wrap it up here. Please, a very, very warm applause to the entire panel. Thank you very much.